Welcome everybody to a Cassandra Voice interview. We have with us Professor Laurent Pech, Head of Department of Law at Middlesex University. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Laurent. And we also have with us Frank Armstrong, Editor-in-Chief of Cassandra Voices. Hi, Frank.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon. And good afternoon, Laurent. And good afternoon, Daniele. It's a great pleasure to have an eminent jurist such as Laurent Pech before us today. And I have firstly a question which I know is not Laurent's area of expertise, but which I think is an important question for an Irish audience, which is I would like to question him on the issue of mandatory hotel quarantines that have been recently introduced into Ireland a year into the pandemic. But this week, the Attorney General issued advice to the effect that quarantining EU incoming travellers from EU member states would potentially be contrary to European law on the free movement of people. So I just wanted to just ask him on a preliminary question, unrelated to what we'll talk about later on that issue.
Yes, Frank, not a problem. As you said, this is not something I'm really paying close attention to. What I can tell you, as someone who has taught, and in fact benefited from EU free movement law for many years myself, until Brexit, that is, in the UK, technically it has always been possible for national authorities to restrict EU free movement rights on a number of grounds, such as public health. But EU law does normally prohibit collective measures. So you can only restrict on a number of grounds the exercise of EU free movement law on a case-by-case basis. And you must always comply with the principle of proportionality. So you cannot impose disproportionate measures in the name of public health. You have to have compelling reasons, and you have to demonstrate them on a case-by-case basis. Now, I'm not familiar with the measures or the new measures contemplated by the Irish government you have mentioned. What I can tell you is that it's fine normally under EU law, let's say, for instance, to impose a medical examination or require a test on a case-by-case basis, but without knowing the details of the legislation, any general policy of quarantining EU citizens or more generally EU residents, regardless of citizenship, in my view, would not be compatible with EU law as I understand it. But then I would need to see the details of what is being contemplated in Ireland. What I can tell you normally is public health can only be used as a ground of derogation for individual cases, not for the blanket prohibition on arrivals from other EU countries. I don't think, based on what you have described, the European Commission would let it fly. So potentially then Ireland could see himself being sued, even though I think politically speaking, the Commission would rather avoid this. I'm not familiar of any EU countries, but maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, which is essentially preventing residents in the EU from traveling as a collectively speaking, and essentially imposing on EU residents trying to get to another EU country a mandatory hotel quarantine, but I could be wrong. So you would need to consult experts who are closely following this file. Myself, I'm more preoccupied with what I have called in my scholarship rule of law backsliding, which is another, I'm afraid, depressing topic of discussion.
Thank you, Laurent. Now, just before we get into more of the detail on this subject, what do you mean by the rule of law?
I don't mean anything myself personally, but I can tell you what the rule of law is in EU law or in the law of the European Convention on Human Rights. In fact, in Irish constitutional law, so we have the case law, which has defined the rule of law quite compellingly. Why are we debating these days the definition of the rule of law? Just because, as Daniele was saying in his introduction, the concept now is being challenged, especially from current authorities in Warsaw and Budapest. Their argument is the rule of law is too vague, meaningless, it does not exist, and it's just kind of a intellectual subterfuge to impose neoliberal policies, whatever. But as a matter of EU law, actually, rule of law can be defined. It's normally defined and understood as a set of legal principles, such as the principle of legal certainty, the principle of judicial review before independent courts, respect for human rights, these kind of principles. I mean, I can give you a full definition if you want to, but you can find the rule of law quite very precisely defined, most recently actually in a piece of legislation which was very controversial, the so-called rule of law conditionality regulation, which is now being challenged, in fact, before the Court of Justice by the Hungarian and Polish governments. One of the legal grounds they're raising before the Court of Justice for the first time, as far as I know, they're arguing actually that the rule of law cannot be defined in EU law, even though it's already defined in EU law. But they're saying that it's an expression and it's not a legal principle which can be used against them to suspend EU funding. So the Court of Justice, for the very first time, is going to have to tackle this this argument. It's not going to fly because I'm telling you the rule of law is to be found in the EU treaties and has been exhaustively defined both in EU legislation and in the case law of the European Court of Justice.
Okay, so you've just given us chapter and verse on the various definitions and various statutes, but surely it is something deeper than that. I mean, it's a set of values, isn't it?
I don't disagree, but as a lawyer, I tend obviously to apply and research the rule of law as a legal principle rather than a political principle. So I have told you about the legal definition, which you can use obviously in judicial proceedings, for instance.
Yeah, but it goes beyond simply a breach of the law. It's something like, to put it in metaphorical terms, it's something like the heart of the body pumping the blood around or something like that, is it?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the essence of the rule of law essentially is that we have rules to prevent the abuse of power. So we can do something about the abuse of power. We can fight abuse of power, abuse of public power by authorities. But to do that, we need independent courts, and which is why one of the core components of the rule of law is independent courts, where you can assert your rights against public authorities. So the essence of the rule of law is essentially that even the king, even the president is subject to the law. There are no distinctions. Everyone can assert his right against public authorities. So this is the essence of the rule of law, even before the EU itself was created.
And I mean, if I may, this is basically, it's one of the many check and balances on a what we can call an healthy democracy. And I mean, you were saying that you have observed that you know, certain countries in the European Union have gone to a path where, as for the rule of law being challenged into its concept, into its very existence, also other type of check and balances as freedom of the press. I mean, it looks like that once one is gone, then the other one follows. If am I
Yes.
right in a way?
Yes, you're right. Essentially, what we've been seeing witnessing in the past 10 years in the EU, we have mentioned already the case of Hungary and then the case of Poland. Essentially, we now faced in the EU with what I have described as a new breed of autocrats. They're not like the old autocrats, essentially, where you see tanks one morning in the streets and then a clear change of regime in the afternoon. It's much more difficult, and they're much smarter than the previous generation. So I have used the concept of rule of law backsliding, or democratic and rule of law backsliding, to describe what has been happening in the past 10 years in these two countries. So essentially, if I have to summarize briefly the process, because it is a process, you start more or less with a relatively consolidated democracy. And then you have these new autocrats, or would-be autocrats, who get elected. They only need to get free and fairly elected once. And then as soon as they're elected, their job is to make sure to rig the system, to undermine the checks and balances before the next legislative elections. Now, how do you do that? It's actually quite not difficult to summarize, because they tend to always apply the same playbook or the same cooking recipe. The first two steps you're going to take is you're going to take capture of the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court of the country, depending on what you have. So in Ireland, that would be the Irish Supreme Court. How do you do that? You either purge the current membership of the Supreme Court, or you appoint new judges to the Supreme Court. You capture the Supreme Court in one way or another. You don't care about whether you comply with the Constitution, because by the time you have captured the court, then you can get the new court to argue that what was a violation of the Constitution is no longer a violation, according to the new judges, between quotation marks. At the same time, what we've seen in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere is that while you are violating the Constitution in plain sight, you have to capture the public broadcaster. Again, how do you do that? If you have a parliamentary majority, it's very easy. You can violate the Constitution and you can just pretend it's not a violation of the Constitution. You're going to appoint a new board, you're going to appoint a new president, and you're going to use taxpayers' money essentially also to bully or try to corrupt or bribe private media outlets as well into submission. Why is it important to capture the media? And because you need to shape a public narrative while you are openly violating the Constitution. You have to explain or try to convince the people that yes, maybe, yes, we are violating the Constitution. Yeah, maybe we are taking control of the Supreme Court, but we're doing this in the name of the people. This is your will. So we're going to convince this is what you want. And then you're going to use some scapegoats in the process. So it's very, what you've seen in Poland, in Hungary, and elsewhere, is that they always have a huge need for scapegoating. So it's going to be George Soros, it's going to be LGBT people. I mean, you name it. You think, and then they change, they rotate. What you can see was perhaps worth stressing, that you have a change of scapegoat every 6 months or 12 months. Once you have exhausted essentially the scapegoat, you move to the next one. And then it could be also academic, so it could be a corrupt journalist, it could be communist judges. You need to smear essentially the guardians also of the rule of law. So once you have captured the Supreme Court and the media, you're going to use scapegoatings, and while you're doing the scapegoating, you're going to then bully into submission other what I call guardians of the rule of law, guardian of democracy, the press being one of the key checks on power. And how do you do that? Essentially, you're going to smear journalists. And something which is actually possibly quite new, I mean, I've seen emerged in the past few years, is that to avoid European criticism, what they do, they use proxies now. So it used to be that, let's say, Frank, you'll be attacked by the new would-be dictator. But instead of doing that directly, they're going to use a proxy now, because it makes it more difficult for the EU or Council of Europe body. So what do I mean by proxy? Like a fake association, a fake NGO, to which essentially, indirectly or directly, taxpayer money is going to be given. We've seen that essentially in the case of Poland, for instance. They are suing historians these days in Poland, but it's not the state suing historians for the writings on the Holocaust. I'm not sure if you've seen this. You use also history as a way of distracting the people from the destruction of checks and balances. And how do you sue historians? Well, you're going to use formally a private association. This is what I call proxies. So the new would-be autocrats are much more difficult, essentially, to fight, because a lot of time, by the time people wake up, it's a bit too late. Kind of the media sector is gone, the judicial branch is gone, and then obviously they're ready for the next elections with the half of the press either bullied into submission or brought to bankruptcy. One of the last steps in this kind of rule of law backsliding process is they always radically change the rules of the game. So by the time you have before the next legislative election, they're going to reform completely the electoral code. They're going to capture the electoral commission as well. So it means that they can essentially rig the elections by, I mean, it's difficult to say, but usually it's enough to control the public ecosystem or the public media ecosystem, but then also if need be, then you can also rig electoral results in a specific constituency through your control of the electoral commission. Also remember, if you have captured the judicial branch, it means that there is no place for you to go to challenge judicially the results of the election, even if the results have been gained through unlawful means. And then the system is entirely captured, and then it's essentially virtually impossible for the opposition to win. It's like, yes, you still have elections. Yes, the opposition can win, but it's like saying that it would be like Italy playing against France except the French team, if the French team would be the bad guys with 15 players, the referee in their pocket. And yes, I mean, you still have a game to play, but it's virtually impossible to win in these conditions. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of there's no, in a way to put it more formally, there is no electoral level playing field anymore. Within 3-4 years, the system has been completely captured. And what do we have in 2020 or 2021? In the EU of 27, Hungary is no longer a democracy. I expect Poland to be another electoral autocracy within the next 2 years. In fact, Poland is quite dramatic in a way. They had 2 presidential elections last year. Both of them were completely unconstitutional. I mean, there is not even a room for discussion. They were held in unconstitutional conditions. The first one was cancelled on the day of the elections because of essentially problems I don't want to get into. But then they organized another election without respecting the time frame, the constitutional time window for a proper campaign. And then when you are the incumbent with the state TV in your pocket, it means then financial limitations do not count, because you can just use taxpayers' money to have a campaign through the state TV broadcaster. So the situation is quite dire, I'm afraid, in the EU. Situation is getting worse, and then possibly now what I call the authoritarian gangrene is going to spread to other EU countries, because people are watching, people are paying attention, and they're saying, well, look, it's working fine for Orban and Kaczynski. So why not me? Why not implementing this recipe as well in my own country?
Okay, can I just come in there? I think what you described about the state dominating the judiciary, packing the court. I think that's I suppose been the term in use in the United States, and dominating the media. I mean, that seems to me to be fairly widespread across Europe. Like if we talk about it more in terms of hegemonic discourse, for example, in the media, operating in countries like the UK. I mean, I remember there was an article in the Telegraph in the UK saying it would be unacceptable for Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom because of his socialist views. I mean, that's a pretty stark reminder that of the dominant hegemonic discourse in the UK media, and where you had, for example, the Guardian newspaper attacking, a supposedly left-wing Guardian newspaper attacking and undermining Jeremy Corbyn with anti-Semitic slurs and so on. While, you know, culturally, the legal profession has always been, you know, establishment. I mean, so those two preconditions, surely they're at work in countries like the UK and Ireland also, I would say.
I mean, yes, you are describing problems which have not which have been recurrent, but I'm talking about problems in a kind of a situation where you can actually address them democratically speaking. Yes, in the UK media market, you could argue that we need to improve the way concentration thresholds are calculated or enforced to make sure that media pluralism is better guaranteed. But what I'm describing is it's a phenomenon of a completely different nature. Imagine essentially in Ireland that 90% of the media market would have the same cover page with the text written by the government. This is what we're talking about in Hungary.
Well, we do have that in Ireland.
I mean, I don't know about Ireland, but I would disagree that this is the situation in other countries. And
I'm talking in relation, in particular, to the pandemic crisis, where the media have tended to report faithfully what the government has told them.
Sorry to interrupt. If I may come in the middle, in a way, I think what Frank is trying to say is, like, it's the fact that, for example, in Ireland, there is a particular situation. In a way, 90% of the mass media is concentrated into three main operators, three main groups. And I do understand that within Ireland you can still have in a country like Ireland you can still have an independent media organization like ours, for example, without being shut down or forced to to comply, as is the case of maybe Hungary or Poland at this stage. But at the same time, this concentration of power into three organizations in the media world, it looks like a ripe because
what you're describing essentially is a kind of a cartel, so to use competition law terms. Yes, I mean, media pluralism is always a fight you need to keep fighting about, essentially, because what we've seen are essentially in a number of countries are excessive media concentrations in private hands, sadly, and then these private hands, for reasons which have nothing to do with freedom of the press, may be tempted to use their ownership of media outlets to pursue business goals. But what I'm describing here essentially is close to a dictatorial situation, where essentially you have one ruling party completely dominating every single sphere in the society. So I'm not saying the situation is perfect, but I wouldn't compare the situation in Ireland to the media situation in Poland or Hungary, where essentially you cannot make a living unless you are working to be the mouthpiece of the ruling party. If you're not doing that, you're going to be sued or you're going to go into bankruptcy by force. So I think we're not like talking about a matter of degree here. We're talking about a completely different situation from a quantitative point of view and qualitative point of view.
And how easily you think that this tendency might spread in the future, considering the past history, other countries?
The situation is pretty bad. I mean, I can accept that the situation is not perfect in Ireland, but let me give you some, perhaps make it more concrete for you. The main newspaper, which is not in the control by the government, is now has now 60 defamation lawsuits pending against it. So can you imagine? They're going to essentially, they're trying to bankrupt this main opposition newspaper through lawsuits. And this is when the control of courts becomes quite handy, of course, because then you're going to punish judges if the lawsuits are wrongly decided, so to speak. In addition to that, you have death threats, you have smear campaigns. So much so that essentially, if you're a critical journalist, then you may have no choice but you need to essentially leave your own country if you want to pursue your profession. What's happening to journalists is also happening across the board to judges, lawyers, academics. So we are talking here essentially about a return to the old-fashioned de facto one-party state. So I'm afraid we have to be aware of the gravity of the situation.
And what are how do you see, like, the question? I think it's pressing is how easy it is for another country to fall under this mechanism. What are the countries that you have on your radar you know, that they may be at risk? Is that political, or it's institutional, or it's like?
So, I mean, currently, I guess the silver lining is that Poland and Hungary are the two most extreme cases of autocratization, at least in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not quite yet, obviously, reaching the Putinization of these two countries, but maybe we're going to get there slowly but surely. In terms of third possible candidate in the EU, now we've been talking about Slovenia in the past few weeks because of the Prime Minister of Slovenia attacking journalists publicly, essentially trying to take control of the Slovenian state agency. This Slovenian Prime Minister is indirectly funded by Orban. So essentially, Orban is trying to export his so-called illiberal model in the Balkans and also in Slovenia. We've been talking about the situation in Romania and Bulgaria for quite some time. Malta has also been in the news following the assassination of a journalist who was investigating corruption cases. So I'm afraid I would say some political entrepreneurs are looking at how successful Orban and Kaczynski have been, and then are trying, some of them are trying to think whether in fact this is not a good way forward. Some people are doing this not for ideological reasons, just they view possibly this autocratic playbook as a good way of winning power and retaining power once you have gained power. But for the time being, I would say the silver lining is that I'm not sure whether this is something to rejoice about, but Poland and Hungary are just the two most advanced by far cases in the EU. I would say I have personal worries about the situation in the UK myself, if we leave the EU for a minute. There are a number of signs essentially pointing out towards autocratization pattern under Boris Johnson. Essentially, there are clear indications that the ruling majority in the UK is trying to dismantle or capture the checks and balances. So essentially, they're trying to annihilate any accountability. Including, we've been talking recently about changes to elections. So usually when you see changes being contemplated regarding the electoral commission or electoral rules or IDs to be required to vote, and surprise, surprise, those who would be the most disadvantaged by the new electoral rules are those not voting for the ruling party. So this is when you have to get worried. And also in the UK, we've been talking about changing judicial review to make it more difficult to challenge public action. And we've been talking also about possibly reducing the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So these are signs in my book of potential autocratization. These are the topics you want to pay attention to.
And do you agree with some of Lord's assumptions analysis of the response to the pandemic, or have you followed that issue?
I have essentially. Personally, I would say I've seen from my point of view what is an excessive use of secondary legislation. So the Parliament has essentially abdicated its role as the key legislator, and the government has taken over, defining essentially or restricting of free movement, something which normally can only be done by the Parliament. So I would say this is also part of potential authoritarian pattern. So we need to really make clear, because once the government is in the business of de facto legislating in place of the Parliament, then essentially abuse of power can be easily committed. And if at the same time judicial review is undermined, then you find yourself essentially without any avenue to challenge the excessive use of public power. I'm not a libertarian myself, but certainly as a lawyer, I have strong concerns when I see the government essentially becoming the de facto parliament in the name of this COVID-19 emergency. So that would be the extent of my agreement with the Lord. And
we'll be finishing in about 5 or 10 minutes, but what advice would you have for media professionals such as ourselves, how can we both maintain democracy in our own society, but also how do we contact, how do we, you know, if this is an EU problem, then we need an EU-wide response. How can journalists in countries such as Ireland assist Hungarians, Poles who are trying to resist the gangrene that you've described?
It's a very good question, but also a difficult one to quickly answer. I think what journalists can do is also try to pay more attention what's happening to their colleagues in countries like Poland and Hungary, just to be ready should it happen also to them in their own country, to be able to detect the signs. There's something the EU can do already, and the EU is looking into actually. There is work ongoing on making it more difficult for public authorities, but also their private proxies, to sue news outlet or journalists in their individual capacity. Have you heard of the concept of SLAPs, strategic lawsuits, essentially against public participation? Yes. So there is ongoing work in the EU to make it more difficult for politicians or oligarchs of these regimes to sue, bully journalists into submission. I would say once the crisis is contained, and as that was one of the key issues raised by Frank, there are, before this autocratization trend, there were major issues about excessive media concentrations in a few hands. So we need to go back to what was essentially the case in the 1980s with strong anti-concentration rules in the media market. So there's a lot which can be done. Essentially, if we want to have media pluralism, we need to have a proper media functioning market. To have a proper media functioning market, you cannot have dominant players essentially fixating the market. So you need to prevent abuse of a dominant position. In fact, liberalism in a way is what we need. We need more of liberalism. Possibly that's where Frank would disagree, but in fact, if we had a well-functioning media market, we would be both protected from public abuse of power, but also private abuse of power. You know, the abuse of power does not necessarily come from overbearing governments, but it can also come from overbearing private actors. Think of Amazon, think of Google. There is a lot of work to be done in this regard. So concentration of power, whether private or public, must be constrained, must be restricted, subject to the law applied by independent courts.
Just to clarify, I'm neither a libertarian nor a neoliberal.
No, I got that.
but I think that there has been I think we in Europe, I think we will recognize in years to come that the state has taken on a disproportionate role, and we will be unwinding that for many years to come, and I fear.
COVID-19, in a way, has been kind of a blessing in disguise for these autocratic regimes, because it has been a convenient fig leaf or pretext to essentially give themselves even more powers than they used to have before the COVID-19, and the name of exceptional situation calls for exceptional powers. But the problem is, once these kind of governments get accustomed to exceptional powers, then they don't want to give it back.
It's very difficult.
Or give them back. So then that's going to be the next battle as soon as the COVID-19 situation is under control. I mean, we need to make sure that parliaments everywhere get back into the business of what they're supposed to be doing in the first place, which is legislating and controlling the executive. These days, what we're seeing is just an executive without being essentially the subject of any meaningful scrutiny from any national parliament anywhere. So this is actually a widespread issue.
Thanks again, Laurent. It was great really valuable to have your time, and regards. Send our regards to David when he next.
I shall.